Today, I'm here to talk about my presentation, Reclaiming the Voice of a Mythic Heroine, Margaret Cavendish's The Description of a New World called the Blazing World. I'm a student at Murray State University. A myth is defined as a traditional story concerning the early history of a people or explaining a natural or social fact. It is also defined as an imaginary person or thing. One of the more famous myths from Greek mythology involves the abduction of a girl by Hades. In Homer's hymn to Demeter, Persephone reaches down to pull on a narcissus, a type of daffodil, and then the earth, full of roads leading every which way, opened up under her. She is stolen away to the underworld. A similar Greek myth involves the bard Orpheus and Eurydice, also taken by Hades, this one leading to her eternal death. But Orpheus travels to the underworld to beg Hades and his queen to take mercy on him and return Eurydice to life. A later retelling of these myths appears in an anonymous 14th century Middle English lay, Breton lay called Sir Orfeo. The earlier Greek myths are recalled when Queen Herodes, wife of the king Orfeo, is this time taken by the fairy king. The queen was away Ituite, with ferdi forth nom. The queen was sudden snatched away, by magic was she from them caught. A similar fate awaits the lady turned empress of Margaret Cavendish's The Description of a New World called the Blazing World. A merchant resolved at last to steal the lady away, which he had the better opportunity to do because her father's house was not far from the sea. In this paper, it is suggested that Cavendish recalls much of the plot and description of Sir Orfeo and another Middle English lay, along with the Greek myths, in order to reinvent the story of Herodes, the abducted queen. By doing so, she empowers the mostly silenced feminine and reinterprets society's mythos to right or wrong. In addition, Cavendish explores the role of the heroine in myth, a role diminished under the patriarchy that favors the hero's journey. The abducted and silenced female is not just the feminine to be empowered for Cavendish, but she's a player on the world stage of ideas. She's involved in discussions on science, philosophy, government, and the like. Furthermore, it is concluded that Cavendish's reinterpretation of mythos by reclaiming the voice of the heroine and empowering her can inspire teachers of social justice today. Myth in literature is often characterized by the hero's journey or heroic journey, a set of steps or patterns by various writers over the years. One such version is the replacement of an ailing king or the rejuvenation of the ailing king. There really isn't a place for women in such literature. Joanna Russ states in an essay that women can't write, but it isn't because they haven't the skills to do so, but there is a lack of the historic substance or legacy to base it on. Yes, all stories are absent of true heroines for Russ. Our literature is not about women. It is not about women and men equally. It is by and about men. There really is no heroic journey. In fact, the term might not even be a part of people's vocabulary today. At least when looking back at the Greek myths of Persephone and Orpheus, women had more agency. Demeter brought up so much destruction upon the earth that Zeus helped negotiate a compromise that Hades would release his niece in all but the 3 winter months. And in Orpheus, it is Hades' queen Persephone who is so touched by Orpheus's music that she convinces her husband to free Eurydice. But are these heroic stories? Russ is right. There does not seem to be a place for heroines in literature. Still, Demeter's voice was able to at least push back on the male-dominated gods of Greek literature. And Persephone could use hers to persuade Hades, albeit with conditions. Later in the 14th century, women's voices in literature would be nearly silenced completely. Hades agreed on the condition that Orpheus did not lay eyes on Eurydice, but while she remained in the underworld. Sir Orfeo is one of the more famous Breton lays. It tells the story of a king whose wife is taken by fairies. She's abducted to an underground world that resembles paradise. But throughout the story, she is silenced. At one point in the story, Orfeo sees his queen, who appears momentarily outside the fairy kingdom, but she doesn't speak. Yearn he beheld her, and she him ac neither to other a word no spake. Intent he gazed, and so did she, but no word spake, no word said he. She doesn't really seem to speak at all in the 605 lines, but the parallels to the Greek myth of Persephone and Orpheus are striking in Blazing World. The city itself was built of gold. The emperor's apartment, it was so rich with diamonds, pearls, rubies, and the like, and precious stones. In Orfeo, it recalls the fairy kingdom. Within, there were wide wombs, all of precious stones. The worst Baileron to behold was all of burnished gold. Within were halls and chambers wide, all made of jewels and gems of pride. The poorest pillar to behold was builded all of burnished gold. Though the two worlds seem to mirror each other, the biggest difference is that in Sir Orfeo, Herodes is silenced. In all the narratives listed above, the females are abducted and taken away to a strange place, and there are men who try to rescue them. In the end, there are men who decide their fate. The protagonist of Blazing World describes her adventure in heroic detail. The gods don't look kindly on her abductor. Heaven, frowning at his theft, raised such tempest and were all frozen to death. The young lady, only by the light of her beauty, the heat of her youth, and protection of the gods, remaining alive. Instead of being silenced, she's given an absolute power to rule and govern all the world as she pleased. The new empress examines her new world and discovers that women are absent from religious ceremonies. It is questioned whether men and women should be promiscuously together in time of religious worship, for their company hinders devotion and makes many, instead of praying to God, direct their devotion to their mistresses. But ask the empress, have they no congregation of their own to perform the duties of divine worship as well as men? No, answered they, but they stay at home and say their prayers by themselves in their closets. Although this passage can be looked upon as silencing to women, it serves two purposes. First, it is in fact social commentary about Cavendish's contemporaries. One can imagine the Royal Society as religious worship and prayers in their closets, as Cavendish's private explorations in natural philosophy. And looking more closely, women are empowered. It can be surmised that in this world, women are easily deified. It is the husbands who direct their devotion to women rather than to their God. This subtle phrasing by Cavendish reveals how women are truly heroic. Blazing World also shows how cavalier Cavendish was in her approach to the science of her day. Women were excluded at the Royal Society, but there she stood in 1667, 1 year after publication of her book, the first woman ever to enter the scientific establishment. Yes, she was ridiculed, but by entering into areas unknown, she showed strength and resilience. And by being accepted into the Royal Society, even for a day, was proof enough that Cavendish belonged to the establishment. In fact, her contributions to the scientific thinking of her day are unquestionable. By making comments such as telescopes caused more differences and divisions amongst them, Cavendish revealed the trouble with how technology can exacerbate differences. Your glasses are false informers, she states. Instead of discovering the truth, delude your senses. Cavendish puts the focus on the observer rather than what is being observed. She raises important questions, but she is committed to a science we think of today with statements such as the following: we shall want employments for our senses and subjects for arguments, for were there nothing but truth and no falsehood, there would be no occasion for to dispute. And by this means, we should want the aim and pleasure of our endeavors in confuting and contradicting each other. This is a key component of the scientific method and the creation of hypotheses to disprove each other. Another prophetic insight is in her support for the differentiation of scientific disciplines by assigning scientific explanations to experts. Cavendish states that any sort of specific knowledge belonged to physicians more than to experimental philosophers. Such differentiation of science is an invention of 19th century society. There's more. Cavendish also contributed to early evolutionary theory, specifically Lamarckism, when she suggests that all animal creatures did continue their species by successive propagation of particulars. Such ideas like acquired characteristics were not common, maybe even entirely absent in scientific thought until the early 19th century when scientists such as Lamarck proposed them. It is not only early scientific theories, but more modern ones that Cavendish somehow had foresight of. Her philosophy about movement, seen in the following statements, allude to current string theory or the theory of everything. Nature is but one infinite self-moving body, and this living self-moving body gives a spirit motion. And going on, there is motion, but in matter. As has been discussed, Cavendish reinvented the Greek myth of the kidnapped girl by making her into a heroine. In doing so, she recreated her own story, which is firmly entrenched in history within the ideas of men. She certainly helped to right a wrong. In other words, she took an old story and made it new. She explicitly states this in Blazing World. Why, said the Empress, do not your poets' actions comply with their judgments? For their plays are composed of old stories, either of Greek or Roman, or some newfound world. The Duchess answered Her Majesty that it was true that all or most of their plays were taken out of old stories, but yet they had new actions, which being joined to old stories made new plays. In addition to her own type of revisionist history, Cavendish's contribution to science is apparent. Some scholars, however, have hinted that her contributions to science should be emphasized over her feminist ideas. It is complicated. Focusing on her proto-feminist philosophy might diminish her flawed but real accomplishments as a writer, or how she challenges the dynamics of the canon, which still conventionally excludes her. Wilkins states that Cavendish's contribution, or noted lack thereof, to science, natural philosophy, must be viewed within the context of the science of the time. She states that this is more important than viewing her role as a woman in isolation from her intellectual milieu. Though Cavendish is known as an anti-experimentalist, Wilkins also states that Cavendish's role in science has more recently been revitalized as a contributor, with many of her ideas shared by her contemporaries. Wilkins notes that it is Pepys' comments that helped shape the narrative of Cavendish's scientific ignorance, which unfortunately set up centuries of intellectual thought, ignoring her scientific contributions. This is Pepys' comment. Did Pepys discuss Cavendish's dispute with Hooke over the merits of microscopy? Did he examine her criticisms of experimental philosophy? Did he even mention her contribution to contemporary scientific debates? He did not. Instead, he confided to his diary that Cavendish was possessed of a dress so antic and so deportment so unordinary that I do not like her at all, although he conceded with some relish that she was nevertheless a good, comely woman. Perhaps criticisms of Cavendish's apparent pseudoscience tendencies is just as alive today as then. It is not without merit. There are certainly problems with her thinking. For example, she rejects scientific possibilities like the weighing of air, and by doing so, within the narrative, she silences the licemen who propose it. She also states that there is no such thing as prime or all in numbers, nor is there any other such mystery numbers. Mathematicians, astrophysicists, and many others today would be shocked by such a thing. But it is Cavendish herself who shows how perfect nature is just by being imperfect. She says nature itself cannot boast of any perfection, but God himself. Cavendish's attack doesn't just attack real science. She also takes on jabs at Islam through her attacks on religion, though her attacks on religion are not discussed here. And regarding government and women, Hints reveals that Blazing World represents an organized society that falls apart with female leadership. This is not perhaps what Cavendish wanted to show the world, but Hints states that the linkage of female gender with a desire for structural innovation is intriguing. It is such innovations, creative thinking, and revolutionary ideas that should be front and center in Cavendish's contribution to literature. Cavendish has certainly used her narrative to let her voice speak loud and clear. Blazing World has contributed much scholarly interest over the years. Dell states that Cavendish uses the travel narrative as a source of power and to also ground it in reality for the reader, as the recent discoveries in science were a source of contention for Cavendish. She used her Blazing World and the companion piece, Observations, as a sort of social commentary for her time. Thill voices her disagreement with how Cavendish's work has been portrayed by critics, and instead locates this author within Restoration scientific and philosophical discourse. Thill emphasizes the duality of Cavendish's work throughout her piece, and she maintains that Blazing World is a dazzling meditation on power. Teachers of social justice today could do well to focus on Cavendish's empowering narrative. Social justice teaching is part of the social reconstruction curriculum ideology as defined by Shiro, and it has had a presence in American teaching since the 1800s, even flourishing during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Basically, social reconstruction educators assume that education provides a means of reconstructing society. Teaching social justice is just one way. We should focus on how Cavendish is able to use her voice in matters of importance during her day in a world dominated by men. We should acknowledge that she has reinvented a mythos, reclaiming the feminine voice in myth in order to speak freely about the events of her day. Cavendish's Blazing World is a shining example of how literature can literally build new and better worlds, a tenet of the social reconstruction curriculum ideology.